will be overlooked once they are there in place. So that's kind of, I was wondering if it is not just about, just something about the word, but really a story of power and who's able to make that practice last longer, sort of in writing or in another form.
I think you're absolutely right on the substance, and I just made a note here, and your question brings home to me that is an idea or a theme that is not sufficiently worked in the paper. And let me tell you where I thought I was beginning to address it, but I disagree completely. Was when I was talking about how people sometimes think about legislation as customizing practice for particular purposes, and other people take off-the-shelf legislation and the practice recustomizes the legislation for particular purposes. And what I did not do sufficiently, and what I attempt to do, is show that very often the most effective form of resistance to power locates itself by using cultural resources different than the resources through which the power is typically exercised. So that if you are in a predominantly legislative tradition, resistance happens fundamentally in practice and in contesting. If you're in a practice and oral tradition where there is the claim to traditional authority or some such thing, the drive to legislation and to writing is a powerful liberator, because it allows you to set that up as a pole of attraction that works against patterns of being. And you're absolutely right on the substance, and you've given me a point where I've got to get the text better written, because that's exactly right.
That's perfect.
Anybody else?
Hi, John. Well, first an observation and then a question. First, I enjoyed the paper immensely. Both my PhD work at UBC and my other life, I work for the government, and it deals with programs. So, the observation, I think, in your paper, the background between evangelicalism and the most recent manifestation of that in the U.S., particularly Jimmy Carter's book, which I read, I found very interesting, because I think not only are that new form of evangelicalism that you see in the United States is not just biblically fundamentalist, it's legally fundamentalist as well. The lawyers who work with those organizations act that way, which is interesting. So I found that fascinating. The second, I guess the question I had was, I agree with your notion that mechanistic text impositions sort of undermine human agency. In my other life, my PhD work involves migrant workers coming in under a government program. But I also work representing the government in hearings with residential schools cases, abuse cases. So, and in that process, we operate from a settlement agreement that was agreed to by the parties, the churches, the government, and the lawyers representing the claims. And there's a tendency in that process, overwhelmingly, to mechanistically impose that agreement. It was a badly written agreement. It was written in 6 days when the government fell in late 2004. So they tried to wrap it up very quickly before there was an election. So that it's a horrible text. Parts of it are vague. Most of it doesn't make sense if you just read it as a document. Yet you have to apply it at hearing after hearing after hearing. What I've found as an individual is I've encountered resistance from a lot of the structures within the government when you try to apply the intent of the agreement versus the mechanistic text imposition. And I think part of it I've learned is the government structure undermines that ability, obviously, to act in that way. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how do you have any suggestions on how do you overcome that built-in structure that undermines the ability to avoid this type of sort of mechanistic behavior, particularly operating in something like a government, which is designed, it seems like, to undermine that. I suppose there's other methods to do it, but it's very, very tough to go against that sort of mechanistic, statutory, or contractual interpretation.
One of the elements that you're raises is what is it about contemporary understandings of governance that make finality the driving logic of public policy? Right? What we want to do is we're in a process of discussion and working, and what is the object is to get something which is going to turn the page and never be revisited, and the text that results therefore becomes a new beginning, because the bureaucratic mechanism of modern government doesn't have the capacity to retain through generations the richness of understanding that the transmission of practical knowledge from mentor to mentee in other bureaucratic forms, like, for example, certain Episcopalian type churches have. So what's important is that once you get the text, you can start with the text and work forward from there. And the text is meant to provide certainty in the sense that the certainty is not necessarily the certainty of outcome, but it is the certainty that this is off the table, and this is off the table, and this is off the table. And the only thing that's on the table is what we have here. And the logic of bureaucracy with lines of accountability is that everybody signed. I mean, when I worked in Ottawa, it was extraordinary. Before a memo would get to the minister, there would be 5 or 6 sign-off levels, and it would go up and down and up and down, and you never. And then ultimately the deputy minister takes it to the. Well, that's the way bureaucracies work, and that's what puts such a high premium on text. What is it that one can do within a system? Well, there is a difference between working within a system as a non-player in the system and working within the system when it's your job. And of course, when it's your job, there are a ton of constraints which do not affect Mary or Tom Citizen. And I'm not about to counsel you to infringe your oath as a civil servant. And that's why legislation like whistleblower type legislation is very important, because what you're trying to do there is actually create space for contestation, legitimate contestation within the public bureaucracy. In all my experiences, whether it be in Ontario, Quebec, or federally, there is very little space for that. As citizen, however, it's different. And one of the things that we're finding in Quebec as we continue processes of negotiation of land claims is that the so-called Northern Quebec and James Bay Agreement, which was imagined by the Bourassa government to be final, has become highly contingent. It actually has become an excuse for a conversation rather than the conversation stopper. And a little pop psychology, I'm sorry to be so lengthy in responding. I think in part that's because we're in Quebec, and the tradition of what a legal text does in a civil law jurisdiction is not the same as the tradition of what a legal text or a statute does in a common law tradition. A statute in a common law tradition tends to be a wise stopper. But anybody with familiarity with the civil code knows that the civil code is the beginning of the inquiry. It sets up an inquiry, it puts hypotheses of action explicitly on the table and invites people to do something with them. So to the extent that the